Hello and welcome to another lesson about language development. In this lesson, we're going to talk about something that you may have heard of in the news or elsewhere in the media called the 30 million word gap. And in this lesson, we are specifically going to provide some nuance so that we can better understand how reliable this statistic is, where we should be applying it, where we shouldn't be applying it, and how we ought to view this in terms of its significance to society. If you're somebody who likes to keep up on politics, you might have recently watched this clip in one of the Democratic debates.
Play the radio, make sure the television, make sure you have the record player on at night, the phone, make sure the kids hear words. A kid coming from a very poor school, or a very poor background, will hear 4 million words fewer spoken by the time they get there.
So what is Biden talking about here? He's talking about this idea that children from lower income backgrounds have heard a lot fewer words by the time they reach school than children from higher income backgrounds. And this is an idea that is very much in the public eye and in the eye of people who are making education policy, that this is a very, very big difference between children from lower income backgrounds and children from higher income backgrounds that makes it harder for children from lower income backgrounds to succeed in school. Now, the number that he is citing here is 4 million words. This is not usually the statistic that you hear cited. That his number is much lower than the statistic you usually hear cited, and usually people will tell you that the difference is more or less 30 million words. And this is called the 30 million word gap. This is the phrase that you will hear in the media when somebody wants to talk about this idea that a child from a lower income background hears 30 million fewer words directed at them than a child from a higher income household by age 4. So specifically, this is words directed at the child. This is child-directed speech. So this doesn't just refer to any words used around them. This is child-directed speech. And for the most part, this really catches the eye of newspapers and things like that because it's a really big statistic, 30 million. It's quite striking. And as with most really big, impressive numbers that get published, this statistic has inspired a lot of people to write about it. So there's been books about it, there's been articles about it, there's been more research related to this, and there's been even a lot of funding thrown at sort of charity organizations that are aiming to fix this problem. You'll also see a lot of things out there in the news that argue against this, that either try to tell you that this 30 million word gap isn't real, or that the money associated with trying to fix the 30 million word gap is being misapplied, or trying to provide some nuance even to this statistic to make it clearer what it actually means. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about that original 30 million word statistic, where it comes from, and to what extent you ought to believe it or be worried about it. But let's have a look at what this 30 million word statistic actually would mean for what a child's daily input of language would look like. So 30 million words is a lot of words. Normally when a person is speaking, just at a natural pace, they produce between about 125 and 150 words per minute is how many words they produce. Since we're talking here about child-directed speech, so speech that's directed at a child, and we know that tends to be slower paced than the sort of language that we direct at an adult. Let's take the lower end of that range and say that you're producing 125 words a minute. Now remember, this is if you're constantly speaking, right? So this is not like, let's chat about something with my baby where we have 4 minutes where we're silently playing with toys and then we say something. This is constant speech like what I'm doing right now. So if you have 30 million words at 125 words per minute, that takes you about 240,000 minutes to say. Now this 30 million word statistic is supposed to be representative of the first 4 years of life. And in your first 4 years of life, if you have 365 days a year plus 1 for the leap year, since it's 4 years, you get 1 leap year day, right? We have 365 days a year. This means that you have 1,461 days of life in your first 4 years. So if we take the 240,000 minutes of speech that we calculated is represented by 30 million words, and we distribute it evenly over the 1,461 days of a child's first 4 years of life, this means that they are needing to hear a difference of 164.25 minutes of speech per day. So that's how many more minutes of speech per day this 30 million word statistic suggests that high-income children are hearing over low-income children. So to make this number 164.25 minutes a little more digestible, let's put it in terms of hours. Now, since there's 60 minutes in an hour, that means that the difference between a lower income child and a higher income child's language input would be 2 3/4 hours per day. Now, that's a huge amount of time. And remember that this isn't just 2 3/4 hours of input that the higher income child gets that maybe the lower income child doesn't. It's 2 3/4 hours more on top of what a lower income child is already getting per day. And furthermore, it's not just like 2 3/4 more time with a parent per day, right? That's what that would suggest to you sort of intuitively that might be possible. This is actually 2 3/4 hours of constant speech directed at the infant. So this is like if an infant had to listen to 2 3/4 hours of lectures per day, and that's on top of whatever a lower income infant is already getting, right? Now, this would be technically possible, but it seems really large, and that should make you feel skeptical, right? So if it seems like, wow, that seems like a lot, people would have noticed this, a lot sooner if this was really the difference, right? It may be the case, but you should be skeptical when you see a statistic like this. And we'll talk about how skeptical should you be and what parts of this statistic you should be skeptical of. But just know that this 30 million word estimate is probably too large. There may be some difference, but it's almost definitely too large. So this statistic is slightly surprising, but where does it come from? Now, the statistic originally comes from a study by Hart and Riesly that was published in 1995. And in this study, they observed the language behavior of 42 families. And they went in and observed these families monthly for 2.5 years. So they sent somebody in to record a couple hours of sort of regular family life. They were told to just go on with their regular family life. And these families came from different economic backgrounds. So there were 13 high-income families, 10 middle-income families, 13 low-income families, and 6 impoverished families. And in some of their study, they combined the middle two groups into one big sort of working class group. But in this study, they observed both the parents' production, so what were the parents saying to the children, and also the children's production, what were the children saying. And they used this data to come up with all kinds of really interesting statistics about children's production. This is a really high investment study and has a lot of really rich, interesting data to look at. And let's see what they did with it. So let's begin by looking at their observations about parents' production of language. Specifically, this is primary caregivers addressing the child, right? So this is when the child is being directly addressed. And if we separate out the income groups, and then we look at the number of words per hour they produce, this is going to be pretty striking. So in the high income group, the parents produce 2,153 words per hour, and that number gets smaller as we move toward the lowest income group, right, where it's down to 616 words per hour. So this is a pretty striking difference. Now, the researchers wanted to know not only like, are you producing a lot of words, but is that vocabulary, richer, right? It's possible that you're just talking a lot more, but what you're saying isn't anything deeper. Maybe you're just saying, here's a doll, here's a doll, here's a doll over and over again, right? It might not actually be that much richer. So the way that they tried to measure this was through this statistic of unique words per hour, right? So how many words different words do you use in an hour? And this is essentially a measure of what's called types, which we'll talk about in a minute. And as we'll see, this is not a very good measure of the richness of vocabulary, but let's just put up their results so that you can see them. It looks like they're going down, similarly to the number of words, right? So the high-income parents look like they are producing vocabulary that's more diverse than the low-income parents. This is actually a very bad way to measure this, the richness of vocabulary. So we're going to come back and address this in a second. But first, let's talk about the way that you should measure the richness of someone's vocabulary. So let's say, for an example, that you want to calculate how diverse the vocabulary is in Moby Dick, right? We want to know how rich is the language of Moby Dick, and maybe we're going to compare it to some other book to see which book has more diverse words or something like that. So one way that we can measure this is just to look at the number of vocabulary words that are in the book in total, right? So if we were to make a dictionary out of the book and put down how many words are in Moby Dick, we would see that Moby Dick uses 2,789 vocabulary words. Now, in linguistics, we call these types, right? They're different types of words, and that's how many types Moby Dick has. Now, that might not be exactly what you were looking for, because Moby Dick is a really long book, and so you could still have a lot of vocabulary words and have not very rich sentences, right? 2,789 is not that many words, right? But you want to know how rich and diverse the vocabulary in the sentences are, right? That's really what you wanted to know. So the way that we would go about doing this, we have to compare the number of words to how diverse the vocabulary is. So first we look at how many total words are in Moby Dick. Moby Dick contains 260,819 total words. In linguistics, we call these tokens, right? So this counts every instance of the as its own individual word, for example, right? So this is tokens. Moby Dick contains this many tokens, and we already saw that it has 2,789 different words in it. So Moby Dick contains 93.5 tokens per type. Now, what does that mean? It means on average, if you walk through 93.5 words in Moby Dick, you will reach a new word on average, right? So, of course, when you start out, it's going to be much shorter because you're still building up your dictionary. But by the time you reach the end, most of the words have already been used. And so you might go through paragraphs and paragraphs before you find a new one, right? So, but on average throughout the book, if you walk through 93.5 words, you will find a new word, which seems like not very diverse, but we'll talk about why you get this statistic in a minute. So now we want to compare Moby Dick to other books, right? Let's compare it to something that we know has a much less diverse vocabulary. Let's compare it to Mike Plays Sports, which is a free ebook that I found on the internet, and here is the entire text of the story. I'm not going to read through it, but it's basically Mike uses one soccer ball when he plays soccer, and then they go through all the other sports, right? So this has not very diverse vocabulary. Anybody looking at this would be able to tell this is not a very diverse vocabulary, especially compared to Moby Dick. So let's look at what its token to type ratio is. So Mike Plays Sports contains 58 tokens and 16 types in the entire book. That's all that it contains. So let's calculate the ratio. So the ratio for this one is 3.625 tokens per type. So that means you only have to go through an average of about 3.5 words in this story before you hit a new word, which seems to suggest that Mike Plays Sports has a much more diverse vocabulary than Moby Dick, which seems completely outrageous, right? That's obviously not the case. So let's talk about how we can fix this analysis in order to figure out how diverse the vocabulary of Moby Dick really is. So here's the essential problem when you're looking at tokens and types. If we compare the total number in your category of how many tokens you've counted and how many types you've counted, when you look at how many words you're producing, for tokens, it increases just like a line, right? So as you produce every word, you add 1 to your total number, right? It increases completely linearly. But as you produce types, at the beginning, you start producing a lot of new types, right? So as you hear every word for the first time, it looks almost like your token count. But gradually, you're going to start running into words that you've already seen. So the word the won't be counted that many times. The word the word he won't be counted that many times. And so that will gradually drift off and start increasing less and less and less as your total number of tokens increases. So as the number of tokens rises, so does the number of types, right? So as you hear more words, you're more likely to hear new words, right? But the rate at which types rise decreases as you look at more and more words. And eventually, those distinctions will become really, really quite stark, which is what happens in Moby Dick, where we have so many tokens compared to the number of types. So in order to really compare the diversity of vocabulary, you have to stop at one of these lines and compare two different things at one of these vertical lines here, right? So you have to decide, I'm going to stop at 500 words and see in the first 500 words how diverse is the vocabulary. And then that's a justifiable comparison, right? You can really do that comparison, and that is a measurement of diversity. So let's see what happens when we do that with Mike Plays Sports, and Moby Dick. So since Mike Plays Sports is so short, we have to use the entire sample for Mike Plays Sports, right? So it contains 58 tokens and 16 types, which means that it has 3.625 tokens per type. Now let's look at the first 58 tokens of Moby Dick. So this is the first 58 words of Moby Dick. We have 47 different words, right? So this is clearly different from Mike Plays Sports, right? 58 tokens has 47 types. And when we calculate this, we get 1.23 tokens per type, which means you only have to go through 1.5 words to find a new word in Moby Dick in the first 58 tokens of Moby Dick. And this is a much better representation of how diverse the vocabulary is. Now, you'd probably get an even starker difference if you had more words of Mike Plays Sports to compare to, right? So if you were looking at the first 1,000 words of something written in the style of Mike Plays Sports and comparing that to Moby Dick, you might even get a more striking difference, right? But you know, the sample size that you use, the number of tokens that you look at will very drastically change the numbers that you get in these token to type ratios. So now that we know how you should calculate the diversity of someone's vocabulary, let's look at how they calculated it in the Hart and Risley study. So in this study, they calculated the number of types per hour, right? Essentially, the number of unique words produced per hour. So let's talk about what kinds of results we would expect to see here and what results we're seeing. So what Hart and Risley are essentially doing is blocking off a set of time and looking at all the words produced during that set of time and then figuring out how many of those are unique types, right? So how many types are produced within an hour. And this would be like if we were trying to measure the vocabulary of Moby Dick by looking at just the first 50 pages and figuring out how many types are in the first 50 pages. Now, on its surface, that seems reasonable, right? We can say in the first 50 pages of text, Moby Dick contains 400 unique words, which means that it has 400 types per section, right? Whatever we've decided is our section that we're measuring. But then what happens if somebody comes to you with a large print edition of Moby Dick, which contains only 352 unique words in that section, right? Because you've got less of the book covered, right? It's the same beginning, you just don't get as far into the book, right? And now our measure is 352 types per section. And now we have somebody come to us with a small print edition of Moby Dick. And in the small print edition, you can fit 476 unique words in the first 50 pages, which says that 476 types per section is our statistic, right? So the problem with their means of measuring is that there's different numbers of tokens produced by each speaker in an hour, right? So you don't always produce the same amount of speech per hour. And so even with the same vocabulary diversity, you know, just the fact that you're speaking fewer tokens per hour will change your impression of how diverse your vocabulary is if all you're measuring is sort of types in that time. So when we go back and look at Hart and Risley's results about primary caregivers, we have to ignore this whole set of statistics. We don't really know what it means. It's not a reliable measure of vocabulary richness because you need to measure, for example, the number of types in the first 100 tokens produced during a given session, right? And that would be a better measure of vocabulary diversity, but we just don't know what this means. We can't prove that this actually shows that the high-income parents are using more diverse vocabulary. This is just, obviously, if you're producing more tokens per hour, which is the top measurement, right? If you're producing 2,153 tokens, you're more likely to have a higher number of types, right? So this is not a reliable measure of vocabulary richness. We can, however, still look at this statistic. So this is the one that people usually cite, which is the number of words addressed to children being different across different income brackets, right? So this is still a compelling difference, and it still deserves to be looked at more carefully to see what do these numbers mean, what do they indicate about a child's exposure to language. And these numbers here are actually what we get the 30 million word statistic from. So what Hart and Risley did was they looked at they assumed that children have about 100 hours of waking time per week. So this assumes a 14-hour waking day, right? So it's a little bit long, but not crazy long, right? And then there's 52 weeks a year, and they're alive for 4 years. So if we multiply each of these numbers by 100, by 52, and by 4, we can get sort of how much we would expect, how many words we would expect them to hear over this time. So in the high income bracket, this works out to being about 44,782,400 words. In the middle income bracket, we get 29 million and change. In the low income bracket, we get 23 million and change. And in the impoverished bracket, we get something more like 12 or 13 million words, right? And so this is the place where, you know, the Hart and Riesly are predicting that children are hearing really different numbers of words, because once you multiply these averages by all this time, you would expect it to produce a difference of about 30 million words. This is actually more like 32 million words in the difference between the highest income and the lowest income bracket. Right, so this is where the 30 million word statistic comes from, is from these averages of number of words per hour. So that 30 million word statistic relies on this original set of average number of words produced per hour. But if we're going to evaluate the 30 million word statistic, we have to think about a couple of things about these numbers. How reliable are they, right? So these were observations made during the middle of the day when everybody was awake and knew that they were being observed, right? And so probably around the time that the child's getting ready for bed, or, you know, when the parent has to be getting ready to take the kid to school and can't be focused on the child or something like that, probably there would be lower amounts of production, you know, in various households, right? So this is probably a high end of how much people are talking to the child, at least in some groups, right? So we don't know, this might be just because of the time and the way they observed them, these numbers might be inflated or even deflated. So why did they get these results is the question. Did they get these results because this is really the amount that people are producing? Or did they get these results as a side effect of the fact that people were being observed? So the obvious explanation for why parental production was different was that higher income parents just address their children more, right? That's just, this is really representative of how people behave in their homes. And this is what Hart and Riesly assume, right? And it's what most people reading this paper will assume, is that this is really representative of people's production. But there's another explanation, which is that higher income parents address their children more when they know they're being observed, right? So this might be a case of higher income parents want to show off that they speak to their child, whereas lower income parents maybe feel uncomfortable being part of a study for a university, right? So if you feel uncomfortable, you might just not talk that much, or you might be embarrassed to use baby talk in front of your child, for example, if you know somebody's observing you. So this is a question of are these results that they got actually representative of these communities, of these types of families, or are they just sort of a side effect of the fact that people are being observed? So why was production different? We don't really know. What's happening when the experimenters aren't present? We don't really know. There's no way to know, right? So we don't know for sure that these numbers are really representative. So when we look at Hart and Riesly's results about parental production, this unique words per hour statistic doesn't accurately measure vocabulary richness. And this one we have some questions about, right? They did go in for a long time in each of these houses, right? So they really have a pretty good idea of how diverse the vocabulary is, but we're not really sure how the observation might have affected the different families. So if we're really going to be sure that these numbers in the words per hour category are right, we would really like to try it using maybe a different methodology, with a different community, with different types of observers, to sort of see if you get the same results regardless of how you do the survey, and see if that might support it. And that's what happened quite recently. A study was published that tried to replicate the original results of Hart and Riesly with other communities. So in this study, they looked at 2 impoverished communities in South Baltimore and the Black Belt of Alabama, in various towns in the Black Belt. And this was an urban community and a rural community. And then they also looked at some low-income families in Chicago and in Indiana. And they looked at one middle-income group in Chicago. So they looked at 5 communities this time. They didn't look at a higher income group. They looked just at these sort of middle to impoverished income groups, but this is the group that people are concerned about maybe having less language exposure. So that's why they chose to look just at these groups. So let's look at this new study's observations about primary caregivers addressing the child, right? So this is the same sort of statistic that was collected by Hart and Riesly. So in these communities, we can divide them again by income bracket along this line here. and we look at the number of tokens per hour produced by each group. So I'm just going to lay them out. I'm not going to read them off. So these numbers look a lot more similar to each other than the numbers in Hart and Risley, which I'm going to put up here just so that you can see. So in Hart and Risley, we see in the lowest income bracket, we see only 616, right? And that number steadily rises as we move toward the highest income bracket, right? In this one, our highest number is here in the lowest income bracket, right? So that's our highest number of tokens per hour is about 1,800 words per hour. And the second highest is the middle class income bracket, but then we hop down to here in this lower income bracket, and then we hop back down to the right. So there's no strong association between how many words per hour and the income bracket that you're in, right? In this new study. So it shows that there is some variation among groups, maybe about how many words a child hears per hour, but it's doesn't seem to be associated with income bracket. So this is a very strong difference between the Hart and Risley study and this new Sperry et al. Study. Unlike the Hart and Risley study, this says that there's variation, but it doesn't seem strongly related to income if it's related to income at all. So this is something that you can really see when you look at the individual families within each income bracket, right? So this is the mean number of word tokens produced by each family in each of these communities. And as you can see, they've included the Hart and Risley data here. So this is their group in Kansas that they studied. This was their impoverished group in Kansas. So if we look at these families and we look at sort of the top end of what Hart and Risley observed is the average that formed the top end of the 30 million word gap, that falls right here. If we look at the low end that formed the low end of the 30 million word gap, it's right here. And most of the families are, they're pretty evenly distributed around there, right? So in this particular income bracket, they tend to be a little bit lower, but, it's not, there's plenty of families that are well above that 30 million, word top line, right, in this black belt group. And we can see the same thing in that lower income working class group, right? So this was the Hart and Risley group. And the rest are new groups, and these are the two lines for the 30 million word gap, right? So most people are sort of in between those lines instead of at the top or the bottom of those lines. And lastly, here's our higher income groups. So we've got two groups here from Hart and Risley. This is their high income and middle income groups, and we've got the new Longwood neighborhood group. And here is their top line. And here is their bottom line. And there are people in these upper income groups that are below that bottom line and people that are above it, right? So individual families seem to have a lot of variation, and it's more strong variation between individual families than it is between economic groups. So having reviewed all that research, where do we now stand on the word gap? One thing that we can say is it really does seem like some kids are having fewer tokens directed at them by their parents than others, right? So some kids' parents speak to them a lot more than other kids' parents do. And we have to keep in mind that this is during observation periods. So this is while parents know that they're being observed, while they have a stranger in the room, right? So this can modify how you behave toward your child. You might be embarrassed to speak to your child in front of a stranger. You might want to show off how much you speak to your child in front of a stranger, right? So these can modify these statistics. But there's such strong differences that it seems like there probably is some real difference in how children are, how much children have exposure to language. And these differences could lead to a word gap of 30 million words, right? So one individual family may speak 30 million more words to their child in the first 4 years of life than another individual family. But it's unclear that the differences between families are strongly associated with family income. So parents behave differently, individual parents may behave differently, but there's no really strong association between high income and low income families. There might be some difference, but it's not a huge, enormous difference in terms of how much it's associated with that income. Not like the difference that Hart and Risley observed necessarily, right? But there's one question we haven't even brought up yet, which is that we've been debating about whether or not there's this gap in how many tokens individual children are exposed to, and is that gap there? Is it not there? what does it really mean? But we haven't really talked about what that means for language learning, right? Does it even matter if there's a word gap? Maybe you're able to learn just fine by overhearing things. Maybe you're able to learn just fine by 30 million words fewer, right? So let's talk about, in the last section of this video, let's talk about why that 30 million words might or might not matter toward language learning. So Hart and Riesly knew that this would be a potential issue with their study, right? So if they couldn't show that that 30 million words actually makes a difference in vocabulary development or linguistic achievement, then it wouldn't be important. So they actually looked at this, at the children's vocabulary over time, and they found that by the time that child reaches 36 months, higher income children have an average of 1,116 words in their vocabulary, right, which puts them way up there. Middle and lower income, which they combined into one group for this, have 749 words, which puts them right there. And the kids from the impoverished group have 525 words in their vocabularies. So this seems like a pretty strong association between the amount of speech they hear directed at them and their eventual vocabulary. And this is how they interpret this, is as a child's vocabulary is dependent on the parental input. But the way that they measured vocabulary is that they assumed that a child had learned a word when it shows up on their audio tapes. So when the child says the word, that's when the child knows the word, right? So they didn't do any testing of children's knowledge that they maybe didn't produce the word during a session, right? They figured they're all being recorded for the same amount of time. They have the same chances of producing the words that they know. So that can be a rough measure of their vocabulary development. But this is actually a really big problem, especially if you're going to compare individual kids, right? So maybe if you were looking at one kid's development over time, that might be a reasonable way to look at it, right? But this is actually a very bad way of measuring children's vocabulary. So let's talk about why that is. What we have here is essentially the token and type problem again. So if we look at the number of utterances produced by the children per hour, so this is not tokens per hour, so this is not the number of words, this is the number of utterances, so it's the number of times they spoke, essentially. And we look at high-income children, it's 310, and in the impoverished group, it's only 168. So kids in this group talked more than kids in this group, right? And so we're essentially looking at the number of types expressed in more speech from the higher income kids and the number of types expressed in less speech by the lower income kids and saying that those are both representative of those kids' vocabularies. So let's see what this would look like if we're trying to figure out the vocabulary of Herman Melville by looking at Moby Dick. So at the time Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick, he had one vocabulary. You know, he had a certain number of words that he knew, right? But if we were trying to sort of get a rough estimate for how many words he knew, and we looked at the first 10,000 words of Moby Dick, right? And we find the first 10,000 words have 1,382 types. Now this is probably not the real number, I just made this number up, right? We could just as easily have looked at the first 7,194 words, in which case we'd find fewer types, right? And so we'd estimate a smaller vocabulary for him. We could also have looked at 5,419 words, in which case we'd only find 910 types. But we would never use these three numbers to say that Melville had three different sized vocabularies, right? We would assume he has the same size of vocabulary, and you just are looking at less text, and so of course you're going to find fewer types in that text. If we look at these numbers of pages that I've selected, these are exactly parallel to the differences in the amount of speech produced by the children in this study. So the children in the highest income bracket produced 310 utterances. The children in the middle income bracket produced 223 utterances, and in the lowest income bracket, they produced 168 per hour, right? So this is like we're saying in a completely different amount of text, you happen to have fewer types, so your vocabulary must be smaller, right? So if we look at their statistics, it's really not representative of children's vocabularies at all. So unless each child produced the same number of tokens, a chart that measures vocabulary this way is useless. We can't use this chart to estimate children's vocabulary. Now logically, more input should mean that children develop better language skills, because they have more data to analyze, they probably are exposed to more types, right? There's all this types of richness stuff that you get from just hearing more language, but this study didn't prove that, right? So we don't have proof from this study that vocabulary is actually associated with the amount of input that you get. So what do we know based on this research about children's early vocabulary development and how that's dependent on the types of exposure that they get and what types of exposure children get? So what we know is that families seem to vary a lot in the extent to which parents address their children directly. Now remember, this is still based on how they behave under observation, but this probably is true, that families vary a lot in the extent to which they address their children directly. What we also know is that this is not very strongly associated with income. In lower income groups, there tends to be more variability than in higher income groups, but there's still tons of variability in this. And we don't know the extent to which these differences actually impact language development. That's these differences in how much speech is directed at the child. We know that there must be some difference because we know that speech directed to a child is more helpful for language learning. It contains more data that they can use, but we don't know the extent to which this is the case. We don't know, maybe there's a threshold of some number of million words that a child needs to hear and then they're good, right? So we don't know the extent to which these particular differences impact language development. So this is often called the early catastrophe. This 30 million word gap is often called the early catastrophe. It seems a little bit excessive to call this a catastrophe when we don't even know the extent to which it matters, right? So this word gap, this one linguistic problem, seems to be exaggerated in terms of its significance and its, the extent to which it's real. There's a lot of this that seems to be exaggerated. What does seem to be true, though, is that kids who grow up in poverty have a different level of school preparedness than kids who don't, right? And this level of school preparedness is almost certainly partly because they have differences in their linguistic experience. What's less clear is that those differences are as simple as how much your parents talk to you, right? So you can't solve these linguistic differences necessarily just by talking more to a child. The truth is that there are more substantive differences between the language exposure of high-income and low-income children than just the number of words that they hear. And most of these differences are due to the fact that children are learning different target dialects, right? So a child who grows up in poverty is not going to be learning standard educated American English because their parents tend to be less educated and to have grown up speaking marginalized dialects. So for example, a child may not hear all the words found in standard American English because their parents don't speak that dialect. They may also hear words that are not found in standard American English. Words like ain't, right, for example, are sometimes taken as this child doesn't know how to speak well, but it really is just because that word is not in standard American English. It is in many marginalized dialects of American English. They may use sentence structures that are different from standard American English, right? So this may make it hard for them to understand a teacher. This may make it hard for them to write well if well is considered, in standard American English. It may be hard for them to write in standard American English because their actual syntactic rules that they're learning from their parents are different, right? It may be that the pronunciations they're used to hearing and producing are different from the pronunciations of words in standard American English. This can make it hard for them to understand a teacher. This can make it hard for a teacher to understand them. It may make a teacher think that maybe they have a language disorder because they're unable to pronounce the words correctly, according to the teacher, when the reality is that they're pronouncing the words perfectly in their own dialect. They just haven't learned standard American English. They may also have different pragmatic expectations than are found in standard American English. So for example, in several studies, it's been found that lower income families tend to use more directive speech with children. So that means when they want their child to do something, they say, go do that, right? Directly, right? Whereas children in higher income families are more likely to hear suggestions of what they should do. So why don't you go clean your room, for example, right? So that's it's the same instruction being given. It's just the way you present that as an instruction is different, right? So if you're used to hearing go clean your room as that instruction, You may not understand that when somebody says, why don't you go clean your room? They're actually giving you an instruction, not asking you why you don't go clean your room, right? And so that can lead to misunderstandings between a teacher and a student that they don't even really realize is a misunderstanding, and that can lead to further conflict, right? So the fact that there's a different target dialect can lead to all of these substantial differences between just the way that rich kids are raised and the way that poor kids are raised. And the problem with these, though, is that they don't have simple solutions. These are really complicated societal level issues that are much harder to solve than just telling a mom, you know, you need to talk to your kid more, right? That's easy. That's an easy solution that we would like to be able to say, oh, that these parents don't know that they need to talk directly to their kids enough, right? But that is actually a misleading instruction, because it's not going to solve all of these big problems that are caused by the fact that people grow up speaking different target dialects. And if you grow up rich, you're more likely to speak a target dialect that's closer to what they want you to speak in school than if you grow up poor. And so to focus on the 30 million word distinction is to ignore all these other more substantive differences. So finally, in conclusion, the 30 million word gap could potentially be real, but if it is real, it's almost certainly exaggerated, right? So because you're recording people in one particular context where everybody's around, you're seeing an exaggeration of how much speech people actually produce, which exaggerates the word gap. If it's real, it's more of a family-to-family difference than it is income-based. While there might be a slight relationship between how much families tend to speak and their income, there's way more variation between individual families than there is between income groups. And we also don't know for sure the extent to which this word gap actually impacts language learning. So the extent to which this word gap matters is unclear. It probably matters to a certain extent, but we don't know how much. And so focusing on the number of words spoken means that we're ignoring more substantive differences, like the fact that children learn different versions of English and then are asked to all attend school in the same version of English. Right, that is the big problem, is that children are learning one language and then being asked to go to school in another language without any means of bridging that linguistic gap. People who talk excessively about the 30 million word gap are then essentially passing the buck. They're passing the blame to the parents of these kids, right? So by saying, oh no, these kids just aren't hearing enough words, all that you have to do is talk to them more. If you'd only talk to them more, then your kid would be ready for school, right? That's passing the blame of what this problem is onto parents who are doing mostly the right things, right? So by saying it's the parents' fault, instead of saying it's the fault of the school that doesn't successfully teach kids who maybe have learned another language, what you're doing is essentially passing the blame to families who really don't need that blame being passed to them, because they have plenty of other things to deal with. So that is our little lesson on the 30 million word gap and its significance and how we should treat it.